right, thanks for coming out. I'm excited to be here. This is my first trip to the Ohio State University. And, before we talk a little bit about science, a little about the subject, I think we should talk about something that's really important, and that's the Ohio State football, So it's nice to be at a school where football matters. I come from a school where football matters, and in fact, our schools have had some history over the last couple of years. So, the colors of white and red are pretty good. And then this year is something that we would like to remember at the University of Oklahoma. But last year is something we would not like to remember at the University of Oklahoma. But if you're a college football fan, it's great that your athletic director, Gene Smith, and our Joe Castiglione come together and make games like these. I mean, these are classic games. You come down to the Gaylord Family Memorial Stadium and whip us, and we come up to the Horseshoe and whip you. It's really good. So, so the same way that our 2 losses last year kept us out of the playoffs, I don't know what will happen to the Ohio State University this year, but it's nice to have 2 programs that have such a history of football. So now that we're done the important stuff, let me talk about my research a little bit. I studied the smallest elements of matter in the universe. So there will be a quiz. I'm a professor. So you want to remember this, but you might know this already, right? Everything in the universe is made of atoms. Atoms are made of nuclei. Nuclei are made of neutrons and protons. And neutrons and protons are made of quarks. So I spent much of my career studying quarks and the properties of quarks. I currently do my research at a laboratory near Geneva, Switzerland. It's called CERN. And at CERN, if you're above ground, you don't see much. Here's Lake Geneva, here's the downtown Geneva. But under the ground, in a ring, a tunnel that's 17 miles around, are these big superconducting magnets. And these magnets accelerate protons to nearly the speed of light, and we smash protons together. If you were to look inside the magnets, you would see like these 2 little holes, where protons travel nearly the speed of light in one way in one hole and the other way in the other hole. The idea is you want to smash the protons together and see what comes out. The analogy I give is, suppose you wanted to know what a car was made of, but you didn't have any tools to take the car apart. What would you do? Do this with your parents' car. You get the car going really fast and you smash it against another car and you see what comes out. And that's what we do. We smash protons together and we build big detectors to see what will happen when the particles collide. So this is kind of an artist's depiction of the tunnel. It's about 300 feet underground. There's a big cavern, and in that cavern we build a detector to see the collision of the particles. This cavern is actually the largest man-made cavern in the world. The detector inside of it, where I work, is called ATLAS. It stands for Toroidal LHC Apparatus, and it's quite large. Here's the size of people, there and there. So protons come in one way. In one pipe, they come the other way. In the other pipe, they collide in the middle. And when they collide, the energy of that collision causes many other particles to be created. Those particles fly through the detector. The computer, along with lots of graduate students who have written software, draws a picture that looks something like this. Each one of these lines is a charged particle that was created in the collision of the protons. And then our job is to try to decipher what happened at the very middle point where the protons actually collide. So I spent, 7 years of graduate school and 7 years as a postdoc so I could see understand pictures like that. Many of you may think that's a waste of time. My parents questioned my decision, but nevertheless, this is what we do. You may have heard of the ATLAS detector, or you may have heard of one of the particles we discovered, because about 5 years ago now, this particle called the Higgs Boson was discovered. And Peter Higgs, along with Francois Englert, 2 of the people that predicted this particle, actually won Nobel Prizes. And if you read the Nobel Prize citation, it says, for the theoretical discovery of a mechanism. So these are the theorists that proposed it, but the mechanism gives mass to particles, and at the very end it says, it was recently confirmed through the discovery of the predicted fundamental particle by Atlas and CMS, and I was part of this collaboration. So I actually wasn't working on this exact thing. The Higgs particle can decay in many different ways, and I was looking for in a decay mode that we've actually just seen recently. It was much harder to see than the discovery in 2012. But this is what I do in my research. It's quite fun. That's why we do it. And it's fun because you're answering questions nobody knows the answer to. When you sit in school, you hear professors talk about things, you take tests, and the answer that people are looking for, or that your professor's looking for, somebody already knows. But when you're doing basic research, you're looking for answers to questions that nobody knows. So if you find the answer, you're the first person to know it. So it's actually quite fun. But tonight I'm going to talk about something totally different. I'm going to ask this question: what does science have to say about God and the place of humans in the universe? And this is a story you may have heard. The story goes like this. Once upon a time, humans thought they were kind of special, and that they occupied a special place in the universe. But then Copernicus came along and said, you know, we're not special. The Earth is not the center of the universe. The sun is, and we're just one of these planets surrounding the sun. So that seemed to be a demotion. And then Newton comes along and says, well, we really, have these laws that govern the universe. And if you have mechanistic laws that govern the universe, maybe you don't need God. And then Darwin comes along and says, well, you really don't need God because humans are just the process of random mutation, natural selection, and there's no purpose in all. And if you've sit in a science class or history of science class, you may have heard a story that goes something like that. But there are multiple problems with that story. The first one is it's just not true. For instance, here's a picture that depicts ideas from Dante's Divine Comedy. Yeah, it's got the Earth at the center, and the sun and everything revolves around it. But in this idea, the things that are at the center are the worst things. That these are terrestrial things rather than astronomical things. In fact, at the very center is hell itself. And so it was thought that the Earth is kind of the garbage heap of the universe, and everything fell to the Earth. And if you went to the center of the Earth, you find hell. And so when Copernicus came along and said, no, the Earth is just like the other planets, it was not a demotion, it was actually a promotion. It took the Earth from being this terrestrial ball to being one of these heavenly bodies. And so one of the problems with this story, we often hear about the relationship between science and God, is that it's wrong. But another problem is that all these things happened before the mid-19th century. And a lot has happened since then. Some of you were even born since the mid-19th century. So the question is, what does modern science have to say about God and the place of humans in the universe? And that's what I want to talk about. I want to ask some evidence for modern science for God. And this will be evidence. In physics and science, you don't have absolute proof. You have evidence for something. Although I believe energy is always conserved, all I have to do is find one case where it's not, and I know that energy is not always conserved. So you never prove anything 100%. You always have evidence and probabilities, and that's what we'll talk about. And I want to first review what is evidence for God from science that's been discussed literally for almost 100 years. From the origin of the universe, the design of the universe, and the rare earth. And I don't want to stop there, though. Once I review that, I want to bring up a lot of things that have been written in the last 10 years or so. So because theists have been for 50 years or more saying that these things point to some kind of deity, in the last 10 years there's been a whole outgrowth of other writings and publications that have tried to refute some of these views. And in order to kind of give you a balanced view and what's really going on, I want to also look at some of the responses that have been given to these arguments for God. So we'll start with these three arguments for God, then we'll have actually a little bit of an interlude. We'll answer some questions that I've posed, not that you've posed yet, that'll be at the end, and then we'll talk about these non-theistic responses. So let's start with the first thing, the origin of the universe. So prior to about 1929, scientists had no idea if the universe had a beginning or not. Most scientists believed that the universe had always existed, that it was infinite in time and space. But in 1929, Edwin Hubble noticed something that is quite analogous to this picture, which is raisin bread sitting in your oven. So if your raisin bread sitting in the oven, the bread eventually rises, and these little raisins, notice that they always get farther apart from each other. And so no matter which raisin you're on, as the raisin bread rises, the raisins get farther apart. Well, Hubble noticed the same thing was going on in our universe. And the raisins are galaxies. And he noticed that all the galaxies were flying apart. Well, if they're flying apart, you can surmise, he was a smart guy, he was a rocket scientist, so he was smart enough to figure this out, that you can run the film backwards. If the universe is expanding now, because everything's getting farther apart, and you run the film backwards, you come to a point when the universe started to expand. And if it started to expand, then it's possible that it had an origin. So this was the first hint that the universe might have had an actual origin. And most scientists didn't like this idea. Arthur Eddington wrote in 1931, shortly after Hubble, philosophically, the notion of a beginning of the present order of nature is repugnant. I should like to find a genuine loophole. And why do you want a loophole? Because if the universe had a beginning, it might have had a beginner. And that idea was repugnant. But we now have a name for this beginning. We call it the Big Bang. And every scientist believes in it. Why? Not because it's philosophically appealing, it's not, but because the evidence was overwhelming. And there are three primary evidences that have caused scientists to believe the universe had a beginning in the Big Bang. One is this expansion of the universe. The second is the amount of hydrogen and helium, the light elements in the universe. And so the models predict exactly how much hydrogen and helium we should see in the universe. Those were really the only elements created at the Big Bang. A little bit of lithium, a little bit of a few of the lighter elements. And we can predict about 1 part in 10,000 what we should see in the universe. And what we predict is exactly what we see. But primarily, the other really piece of evidence that has convinced scientists that the universe had this Big Bang origin is the temperature of the universe. So let me talk about that just a little bit. So the universe started out really hot and dense, and then it's been expanding and cooling since its beginning. So let's take the analogy of an oven. Suppose you were to take your oven and get it really hot and turn it on, like you're going to bake something, and then after it gets really hot, you turn it off and you open the oven door and you leave the house. Well, eventually the heat would dissipate throughout the whole house, and the whole house would be slightly warmer because the oven was at once very hot, very concentrated heat. Well, this is what we've noticed in the universe. In 1948, two physicists, Ralph Alpher and Robert Herman, predicted that if the universe started in a hot Big Bang, we should see this leftover heat, this residual heat. And in 1964, two scientists from Bell Labs, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, discovered this heat. I mean, it's not very hot. It's 2.726 degrees above absolute zero. And it's called the cosmic background microwave radiation. And it's the leftover heat from the original hot, dense Big Bang. We've studied this cosmic background microwave radiation in a great detail. The latest satellite to study it was the Planck Satellite. And this actually gives us a picture of what the universe was like about 380,000 years after it began. And again, what we see here is an unfolding of the whole sky, and the slightly darker spots are slightly cooler, and the slightly redder spots are slightly hotter. And the difference is really tiny, about 1 part in 100,000. So it's almost perfectly the same temperature. There are very slight irregularities in the temperature. Those irregularities turn out to be the seeds of galaxies that are formed some 500 million years later or so. And it turns out that, again, what we predict and what we see agree to 1 part in 10,000. When you have a theory that agrees with what you observe to 1 part in 10,000, you start to believe that theory is true. And so this is the overwhelming evidence that have led scientists to accept that the universe had this, what we call Big Bang origin. But there's more than just the observations. In 1915, Albert Einstein came up with his general theory of relativity. And the general theory of relativity describes gravity. But what Einstein noticed is that the equations of the general theory of relativity predicted that the universe should be expanding. And Einstein didn't like that idea. So he actually added a fudge factor, something we call a cosmological constant. And when Hubble discovered that the universe was expanding, Einstein retracted the cosmological constant and said it was the worst mistake of his scientific career. He should have believed his own equations, that the universe is expanding. So not only do we see the universe expanding, but the equations predicted it. Then in 1973, 3 scientists, Stephen Hawking, Roger Penrose, and George Ellis, expanded Einstein's general theory of relativity to include not just that space was growing, but that time itself actually had a beginning. And so they realized that the theory of general relativity predicted a beginning of time itself. And then in 2003, 3 scientists, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, came up with what we call the BGV theorem. And the BGV theorem says basically that any universe that is expanding on average had to have an actual beginning. So why do I put these up? Because this is the best theoretical understanding of physics that we have right now. And the best theoretical understanding agrees with the best observations that the universe actually had a beginning. Space, time, matter, and energy. Now, what does it mean to not live inside space or not have time? I don't know. But what we know is that those things had a beginning. So the Big Bang is not an explosion of something that existed. It's in fact the origin of everything we know in the universe, space, time, matter, and energy. And if you have a beginning, an origin of everything in the universe, then that has some implications. And those were understood, have been understood. Paul Gribben wrote, the biggest problem with the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe is philosophical, perhaps even theological. What was there before the Bang? And that's the big question that we don't know. But what we do know is this: if the universe had an origin, then whatever caused it can't be part of this universe. It has to be transcendent. Now, transcendent could be supernatural, but it doesn't have to be. It just means not a part of this universe. So what we know from science definitively is that the cause of this universe is from outside the universe, that it's transcendent. So all observations, all theoretical calculations, without exception, indicate this fact, that the universe had an actual beginning in which space, time, matter, and energy came into existence. So what does that mean? It means that the cause of the universe can't be part of the universe. It must be transcendent. Now here's where I make a switch, in some sense, from science to theology or religion. It means that any worldview that does not include a transcendent cause is not compatible with what current science has found. But those that do would be supported by science. So if your worldview doesn't have a transcendent cause for the universe, a cause outside of the universe, then it's not compatible with what we know is true. So God, which is my evidence for God as described in the Bible, is transcendent. So other religions don't have that. And any religion without a transcendent cause is not compatible with what science has found. So what I would claim then is scientific observations and calculations support a case for the existence of this biblical God. Now, this is not something that's new. These theological implications have been around, and they weren't invented by theists. One of the most profound statements of the theological implications is given by Robert Jastrow, who's an agnostic. He writes, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the rock, he's greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries." It's not theologians who've said that the Big Bang origin points to a transcendent cause. It's the science itself that points to it. But it is remarkable that what science has discovered is in correlation with what theology has said for years. The universe had a beginning. The very first sentence in the Bible said there's a beginning in which the universe was created. The stuff of the universe did not exist at one time. The writer of the Hebrews says, "We understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible." And then finally, that this creator lives outside of space and time. In fact, the New Testament is the only holy book in the world that explicitly talks about a divine being who acts outside of time. And Paul wrote that grace was given before the beginning of time. So 2,000 years ago, no one had any concept that time had a beginning, and this writer is saying that God was acting before time had a beginning. So the origin of the universe points to a transcendent cause, something that looks a lot like God. The second thing I want to talk about is the design in the universe. Now, design in the universe is closely associated with something we call the Anthropic Principle. The Anthropic Principle is the idea that many of the parameters in the universe seem to be fine-tuned to allow humans to exist. It's as if you had like a control panel with 100 knobs or something. And if I take any knob and turn it just a little to the right or a little to the left, I get a universe that's inhospitable to life. Maybe the definitive book on this was written in the mid-'80s by Frank Tipler and John Barrow. It's called The Anthropic Cosmological Principle. It's a really thick and dense book. Even though I think it's a great book, I don't recommend it unless like calculus is light bedtime reading for you. And if calculus isn't, then it might be a good book to read at night, because if you have insomnia, it'll put you to sleep. But anyway, in this book, they list like 100 things that are finely tuned for the universe to exist. I don't have time to list 100, but I'll list a few of them to give you the idea. One of them is the strong nuclear force. So let me explain what that is. This is the test or part of the test I said I'd give you, right? Everything's made of atoms. Atoms are made of nuclei. Nuclei are made of neutrons and protons. Neutrons and protons are made of quarks. By the way, if anyone knows what quarks are made of, let me know. We'll write a paper and win a Nobel Prize, because no one knows yet, but if you know, let me know, okay? So what is the strong nuclear force? It's the force that binds the quarks together in the neutron and proton and eventually holds the nucleus together. It's because of the strength of the nuclear force that we have our periodic table. If I was to take the strong nuclear force, the knob that controls it, and make it 2% stronger, I would get rid of hydrogen in the table. Right? So that would not be good for life. What is H2O? Water, hydrogen. What is our sun burn as its fuel? Hydrogen. So if the knob for the strong nuclear force is turned 2%, I don't have stars that burn, I don't have water, I don't have life. If the knob for the strong nuclear force is turned the other way and made 5% weaker, then all I have is hydrogen. Everything else ceases to exist. Now that would make chemistry class really easy, because there's the periodic table hanging on the wall, but it's not good for life. So another thing that is finely tuned for life is the amount of matter in the universe. So as the universe is expanding, everything is attracted to everything else by gravity. So if there's too much stuff in the universe, gravity causes this, like a rubber band, to stop expanding and contract before there's time for stars and planets to form. If there's too little matter in the universe, then everything flies apart so fast that you can't form stars and galaxies. And so the amount of matter shortly after the universe was born, at about 10 to the minus 32 seconds, is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 60th. If you had changed the amount of matter by 1 part in 10 to the 60th at that time in the universe, you would not have a universe today. So Paul Davies writes, to choose rho, the amount of matter so close to the critical amount, fine-tuned to such stunning accuracy, is surely one of the great mysteries of cosmology. If the crucial ratio had been 10 to the minus 57th rather than 10 to the minus 60th, the universe would not even exist, having collapsed to oblivion after just a few million years. So these scientists I'm quoting are not theists. They're all agnostic or atheists. They just see this kind of fine-tuning. They see these theological implications. Now, I gave this talk once, and a physicist came up to me and said, "You can't use that for the fine-tuning argument." And I said, "Why not?" He says, "Because we think we know why the universe is so fine-tuned, why it's fine-tuned the matter to 1 part in 10 to the 60th. It's something called cosmic inflation. And it's possible that cosmic inflation forces the matter density, the amount of matter, to be exactly what you want." So I began to think about this. So here I have a mechanism that itself has to be fine-tuned in order to create what I want. Well, if you have a finely tuned mechanism, if I have a bunch of robots perfectly programmed to build my car, does that mean that there's no, intelligence behind it or no fine-tuning? A mechanism that works is just as efficient in fine-tuning as anything else. And so just because I know how it works doesn't take away fine-tuning. An efficiently tuned mechanism requires an explanation that still exhibits the characteristics of design and fine-tuning. And so there's lots of models of inflation that might not give a perfect universe, but ours did. So this mechanism seems to be fine-tuned. Just because you know how it's done doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't also exhibit the characteristics of design and intelligence. So that's two things: the amount of matter in the universe, the strong nuclear force. The last thing I want to talk about that seems fine-tuned is the amount of carbon, or how carbon is formed. So all of life is made of carbon. Carbon is the only atom we know, molecule we know, that can form long chains that can store information like in DNA or RNA. And all the carbon in your bodies was created when stars die. So stars, like everything else, have a lifetime. They're born, they live for a while, and they die. And certain stars, the last thing they do as they die is make carbon. And some of that carbon then eventually is what you and I are made of. So poetically, you and I are all made of stardust, because we're all made of stuff that stars have given off. And the process of making carbon as stars die is very complicated. It has to do with things called nuclear resonance states. I've tried to explain those to audiences. I was at Stanford once and tried to explain nuclear resonance states to them, and by the time I was done, they were all asleep. So I've decided not to do that, but instead I want to give you an analogy. So trying to make carbon in stars as they die is a lot like a Rube Goldberg machine. So here's a Rube Goldberg machine. You fly a kite, and the kite pulls a string, and it opens up the door to the cage, and so moths come out of the cage, and the moths eat the coat, which makes it weigh less, so that causes the shoe to drop on the switch, which turns the iron on, which burns the squirrel, so he runs up the tree and jumps into the basket, which raises the cage so the bird can sharpen the pencil. So this is a pencil sharpener, right? And if anything goes wrong along the way, you don't have a sharp pencil. Well, this is how this carbon works. If any of these nuclear resonance states aren't perfectly tuned, you have no carbon, you have no life. And a lot of research has been done on this. Recently, 3 scientists, one from North Carolina State, realized that inside each neutron, there's the test again, inside each neutron and proton are 3 quarks. And the mass of those quarks, how much they weigh, is precisely tuned to allow these nuclear resonance states to work. He writes, we find that more than 2 or 3% change in the light quark mass, that is, the mass of the quarks inside the neutrons and protons, would lead to problems with abundance of either carbon or oxygen in the universe. So if I take the knob that tells me how much do the quarks inside the protons weigh, what's their mass, and turn it 2 or 3%, then I don't have carbon, you have no life. So I've just listed a few things. I've listed 3 fine-tuning things: the strong nuclear force, the amount of carbon, and the amount of matter in the universe, or the formation of carbon. But there are lots of things, maybe 100 such finely tuned parameters. And scientists have noticed this, and they say things like this: such properties seem to run through the fabric of the natural world like a happy thread of coincidences. But there are so many odd coincidences central to life that some explanation seems required to account for them. John Gribbett and Martin Rees write, if we modify the value of one of the fundamental constants, something invariably goes wrong, leading to a universe that is inhospitable to life as we know it. When we adjust a second constant and attempt to fix the problems, the result generally is to create 3 new problems for every one that we solve. The conditions in our universe really do seem to be uniquely suitable for life forms like ourselves, and perhaps even for any form of organic complexity. So I've talked about the evidence for God from the origin of the universe, the design of the universe, and then finally I want to talk about the rare earth. And what I want to ask is this question: what's required in order to have a planet that is capable of supporting higher life forms? Now, by higher life forms, I mean anything more complex than bacteria. Bacteria can thrive anywhere, but more complex life requires certain characteristics. Now, we all know the answer to this. You've all watched Star Trek, and you know that the universe is full of beings like us, but with bigger ears or green skin or some kind of nose ridge or something. But, it must be easy to make planets like the Earth. And well, it may not be. First of all, you have to live in a spiral galaxy. This is what the Milky Way galaxy would look like if you were far away from it. The spiral things that look like clouds are hundreds of billions of stars or billions of stars. And you have to be in a spiral galaxy. About 10% of the galaxies are spirals if you want higher life forms. In elliptical galaxies and irregular galaxies, which are the other kinds, star formation rates and radiation rates would make higher life forms impossible. And you can't be anywhere in the galaxy. If you're too near the center, there's a supermassive black hole. If you're too far from the center, there's not enough heavy elements. So there's a special zone called the galactic habitable zone, and your star has to be somewhere there. And of course, our sun is in the right galaxy, in the right place of the right galaxy. Our sun is unique too. It's called a class G star. It's the only kind of star that burns long enough and stable enough to support planets like the Earth. Some stars burn really hot for a while and then really cool, and you can't have planets that would support higher life forms. Our star is also what we call a third-generation star. And this is really important because it touches on another point. So suppose you start with a Big Bang and you want to make a star that can support life on the Earth. The first-generation stars were just made of hydrogen and helium. And so they have no rocky planets around them. And they live a very short life and they die. And when they die, they create some carbon and silicon and iron and things like that, but not enough to create an Earth-like planet. So some second-generation stars have to eventually die. And when they die, the debris from their death coalesces into another solar system, a third-generation star. And that's our sun. It takes about 9 billion years from the Big Bang to create a third-generation star. And that's when our sun was born, about 4.5 billion years ago, 9 billion years after the Big Bang. So suppose you start with the Big Bang and you want to create a star that can support a planet like the Earth. It takes 9 billion years. Now, why is that important? Because there's some people that ask me, well, if there is a designer of the universe, why is the universe so big? In fact, if you watch the movie Contact, that was a big part of the plot. The universe is so big, there must be other life out there. If there's no other life, it's a lot of wasted space. Well, I don't know if there's other life there or not, but I do know that the universe is not too big. Here's why. Because it takes 9 billion years to create a star like the sun. And in those 9 billion years, the universe keeps growing. And it gets bigger and bigger. And the older it gets, the bigger it gets. And the shortest amount of time it takes to create a star like our sun is 9 billion years. Therefore, after 9 billion years, you have the shortest amount of time, so you have the smallest universe. In other words, this is the smallest universe you could have, starting with the Big Bang, and have a single planet with life on it. If you have any longer time, then the universe gets bigger, but this is the shortest time and the smallest universe. The question is not, why is the universe so big? The question is, why is the universe so small? It's as if we come along immediately when we can, which means this is the smallest universe that you could have a single planet for life. So if somebody says, well, there's a lot of wasted space. No, there's exactly the right amount of space, because I need exactly this amount of matter, fine-tuned to 1 part 10 to the 60th, and exactly this amount of time, and in this amount of time, the universe gets this big, and it's the shortest amount of time, so it's the smallest universe, right? So we also have a planet that's unlike any other planet. There's lots of factors that make our planet suitable for life. Everything from its size, its rotation rate, the amount of water, even tectonic activity. You know, tectonic activity causes earthquakes. I lived for 20-some years in California. I know what earthquakes are. I now live in Oklahoma, and actually Oklahoma last year had more earthquakes than California because of injection wells. So whenever we have an earthquake in Oklahoma, my wife and I try to predict its magnitude because we're from California. And so we make bets, 4.4 or 4.3, who knows, you know? But we can always guess within like 0.1. But anyway, you need tectonic activity to have a planet like the Earth. It recycles carbon dioxide. It helps create the magnetic field in our core. If you didn't, it makes the water cycle correct. If you didn't have tectonic activity, you would either have runaway water, so it's all water on the Earth, or no water, basically. It causes continents to grow. So there's lots of factors that make the Earth just right. A single large moon stabilizes the tilt of the Earth. A single large planet, Jupiter, that's in a nearly circular orbit, acts like a shield, protects us from comets and asteroids that would hit the Earth. So we really live in this amazing place. Donald Brownlee and Peter Ward write this about the Earth. If some godlike being could be given the opportunity to plan a sequence of events with the express purpose of duplicating our Garden of Eden, that is, the Earth, that power would face a formidable task. It is unlikely that Earth could ever be truly duplicated. So there's a lot of these things about the Earth, about this planet, about the fine-tuning in the universe, and scientists notice this, and they write things like this. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces we're speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. Alan Sandage is actually a scientist who became a believer in God. He was an atheist, and he changed his mind because of these kinds of things. He says, I find it quite improbable that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God to be is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something instead of nothing. So everyone has to wrestle with this question: how could such an improbable universe exist? And I want to take you back to this definitive book by Tipler and Barrow. So Tipler and Barrow believe that the universe is so well designed that there must be a real designer. They also believe that there's no God and that there's no other intelligent life in the universe. They go through a long explanation of why they don't believe there's any other intelligent life in the universe. So they have a problem. The universe is designed, it needs a real designer, but the only intelligence is humans and no God. So who creates the universe? You see the problem? So their explanation is someday humans will evolve to become like God, godlike beings, and they'll reach back in time, and they'll create the universe for themselves. So here's my depiction of that. Okay. Photoshop, he didn't really paint it like that. So that seems kind of absurd, but if you don't believe in God and you look at the evidence that the universe seems designed, this is what you're left with. Now, there are other options. Most people today believe that there's an infinite number of universes, what we call a multiverse. So almost all the other universes would be inhospitable to life, and we just happen to live in the right one. We got the right lottery pick. But there's another explanation. It's that if the universe looks like it was designed and created by a transcendent being, then maybe there really is one. And this is powerful evidence. I want to show you one case study. Anthony Flew was one of the leading proponents of atheism in the 20th century. And he eventually became a deist, believing in God, not a personal God. And he was interviewed. And the question came up in the interview. Flew says, "I think that the most impressive arguments for God's existence are those that are supported by recent scientific discoveries." And the interviewer asked, "So you like arguments such as those that proceed from Big Bang cosmology and fine-tuning?" And Flew said yes. The proponents of atheism were up in arms. They said he's 80-some years old, maybe he's senile. Because who would ever change their mind based on the evidence? But he spent his whole life as a proponent of atheism, and this evidence caused him to change his mind. Now, before I go to some of the latest objections to this evidence, I want to answer 4 questions that I get asked a lot. Isn't this simply God of the gaps evidence? Can science say anything about the supernatural? Does attributing something to God's actions suppress scientific inquiry? And doesn't a confirmed mathematical theory remove the need for God? So I want to answer those 4 questions, then I'll look at some of the more recent objections to this evidence. So the first question, isn't this simply God of the gaps evidence? For those of you who don't know, a God of the gaps argument appeals to God as the solution or explanation for something we don't understand. And I don't believe that most God of the gap arguments are very good. So if I don't understand this, I say, oh, God must have done it. And this is an argument I hear all the time. Oh, ancient people didn't understand thunder, so they attributed it to God. We now know better. But I'm not talking about God of the gaps arguments. I'm talking about things we do understand. We do understand the matter density of the universe. We do understand the strong nuclear force. We do understand how carbon is made. We do understand the origin of the universe up to a point. And those things appear designed and purposeful. This is not a God of the gaps argument. This is appealing to what we do understand and trying to explain it. The second question, can science say anything about the supernatural? So, first of all, there's no single definition of science. Some people would limit all scientific conclusions to natural causes, but that's a philosophical statement. If science is limited to natural causes, then it can't say anything about the supernatural. But when scientific observations and theological considerations converge on the same conclusion, to me it's reasonable to assert that scientific discoveries support the theistic proposition, and that's exactly what's happened. In the case of the universe, the observations have led to the conclusion that the universe had a transcendent cause, it looks fine-tuned, and seems to have a place for humans, in exact agreement with what theologians have said. And so when the two come to the same conclusion, I think one can be used to support the other. The third question I get is, does attributing something to God's actions suppress scientific inquiry? And the answer is absolutely not. Knowing who did something doesn't answer the more important questions of how or why. We know that somebody put these big statues on Easter Island. And I've seen, documentary after documentary trying to answer the question, well, how did they move the statues? How did they build them? Why did they do it? So just because I say this looks like an intelligent, transcendent designer, it doesn't answer the question of how or why. Because mostly, according at least to the Bible, God acts through natural means. So I don't look for a miracle in how God necessarily did the fine-tuning. I know how the moon was formed. It looked fine-tuned. It's a natural thing. That's the normal thing for God's action. So this idea that if you say God did it, well, that stops all questions on inquiry, it's just ridiculous. Because we still want to know how and why, and the how is the scientific question we're trying to answer. The fourth question I get a lot is, doesn't a confirmed mathematical scientific theory remove the need for God? Well, again, equations describe the universe, they don't explain the universe. Right? If I have all the equations and engineering drawings for a jet engine, It doesn't explain the engine's existence, and it doesn't have the power to create the engine. I still have to do something to take those equations that describe the engine and make the physical thing. And this is understood by almost all scientists. Stephen Hawking wrote this in A Brief History of Time. Even if there is only one possible unified theory, even if there's the perfect mathematical equation, it's just a set of rules and equations. What is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? The usual approach of science of constructing a mathematical model cannot answer the questions of why there should be a universe for the model to describe. Why does the universe go to all the bother of existing? So just as I can write an equation that describes what's going on, it makes predictions. It doesn't explain the why. All right, so let's kind of review what I've talked about, modern science and God. The Big Bang origin says that the universe had a transcendent origin, and that started in the 1930s. We're still getting evidence. None of these, topics have been closed from scientific inquiry. The Anthropic Principle seems to say the universe appears designed for humans, and then finally the rare Earth says that the habitable Earth seems rare, if not unique. And this evidence for these three ideas has only become stronger. I've been giving talks about this evidence for about 15 years, and the evidence now from these three areas is much, much stronger than it was even 15 years ago. But science changes rapidly. New things come along. So what's been observed that might challenge these theistic conclusions? And there's been a whole plethora of books that have been written to try to challenge these. The first one is probably A Brief History of Time by Hawking. But recently, Larry Krauss wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing. Victor Stenger wrote a book called The Fallacy of Fine-Tuning. And I want to talk about some of these. One of the early books that actually delved into this topic was called The Grand Design by Hawking and Mlodinow, written in 2010. And this was great when I read it. In the first chapter, they posed three questions. And here are the three questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we exist? And why this particular set of laws and not some other? And I read those and I go, those are exactly the three things I've been talking about, right? Why is there something rather than nothing is the origin of the universe. Why do we exist? Partially has to do with the rare Earth. And why this particular set of laws and not some other is the Anthropic Principle. And it occurred to me that the fact that these guys felt compelled to write this book shows how powerful these arguments are, and how prevalent they are, and how compelling they are. Because they want to try to answer these questions that theists have been saying point to God for 50 years. So I want to go through these three things, the rare Earth, the Anthropic Principle, and the origin of the universe, and tell you what the latest rebuttals are if you don't believe them, the latest response. So what's the latest response to the rare Earth? It's there are a lot of planets out there, so one must have life. In fact, we've discovered over 3,000 planets. So doesn't it make sense that one would have life? Well, maybe. Let's ask this question. Should we expect to find a planet like the Earth among so many planets? What does it mean to be an Earth-like planet? And what conditions are really necessary to have a planet that can support something more complex than bacteria? So in the paper, you'll often read that scientists have found another Earth-like planet. Don't believe them. Let me tell you what they mean by Earth-like planet. One of three things. Either the planet is in the right place around its sun to have liquid water on the surface. Well, our moon is in the right place around the sun to have liquid water on the surface. It's not Earth-like. Or they mean that it's about the same size as the Earth. Well, Venus is about the same size as the Earth. It's not Earth-like. Or they mean it's rocky and not made of gas. Well, Mars is rocky. Mercury is rocky. So it means one of those three things, but it's not an Earth-like planet. In fact, there was a great article in the Wall Street Journal by Mike Brown, a Caltech astronomer, a few years back. He said, we need to quit saying we found Earth-like planets. These are nothing like Earth. So what do you really need to get an Earth-like planet? Well, scientists do this thing we call back-of-the-envelope calculations. They're kind of educated guesses. And so I want to make an educated guess as to what it would take to find an Earth-like planet. We've mentioned some of these parameters. It has to be in a spiral galaxy. That's a 10% probability. The star has to be the right distance from the center. That's about a 20% probability. The star has to have a right mass. That's a low probability. There has to be tectonic activity. This is a guess. We don't know how many planets have tectonic activity, so we're saying maybe 5%. None of the planets we know of in our solar system have tectonic activity, so it's a guess. Now, this is just a partial list of the things that are necessary have a planet that can support higher life forms. Here's a more complete list. Okay? There are 322 things that have been identified that have to be in place for a planet to support higher forms, more complex bacteria. Not that it has liquid water only, not that it's the same size as the Earth, not that it's rocky, but 322 things. And when you do the math, including correlations and longevity coefficients and other things, you get a probability of 10 to the minus 304th of finding a planet like the Earth. Now, there are a lot of planets. There are at least 10 to the 22 planets, maybe 10 to the 23 in the visible universe. So you still have a probability of one Earth-like planet formed by chance of about 10 to the minus 282. So in science, we have a technical term for a number that small. It ain't going to happen is the technical term, right? So this claim that since there are many planets, one must be able to support life is really an unsophisticated claim. You can do a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation and find it's probably not true. So it's a naive statement to say, well, there are lots of planets, so there must be one that can support life. So what's the response to the design and fine-tuning? Well, there's a couple of responses. One of them is that there are many universes, and we happen to live in the right one, and there's lots of theoretical models for what a multiverse might look like. There's no real mathematical model. It's all speculation. Here's one example. M theory, which is a form of string theory, predicts there are at least 10 to the 500 different kinds of universes out there. Now, there's no evidence for any of these, so they're not really scientific. They're speculation. And this is the problem. If there are 10 to the 500 universes, then anything can happen. It's not really a theory that's predictive. It predicts that everything happens. And this is understood. John Horgan wrote, M theory, theorists now realize, comes in an almost infinite number of versions, which predict an almost infinite number of possible universes. Of course, a theory that predicts everything really doesn't predict anything. So science isn't based on these speculations. It's based on experimental results, observations. And there is no observation of a multiverse. And it leads to some actually ludicrous scenarios. So if there's an infinite number of universes, then everything's already happened. So I've already given this talk to the Ohio State University and some other universe. Right? And everything with a slight variation has happened. I've given this talk in exactly the same circumstances, but one of you weren't here. Okay? And everybody else wasn't. And these are the kind of ludicrous scenarios you get if there really is an infinite number of universes. Okay? But even if we were to discover a multiverse, would that remove the need for God? What would that do to this argument? Well, first of all, we don't know, because we'd have to have a real theory with real math before we can make any decisions about what it means. But beyond that, I ask the question, is a multiverse necessary to have any planet with complex life? 100 years ago, if you had said we need a universe that's about 30, 40 billion light years across as the smallest universe to create one planet, you would have been laughed at. But it's true. So maybe we need a multiverse if some God wants to create one planet. I don't know. It doesn't automatically remove things. How many universes would an infinite God create? 1? 10 to the 500? So it's possible, actually, depending on what mathematical model we would get, that the discovery of other universes, if it could ever happen, would actually give better evidence for God. That's been the slope so far. Everything we do discover makes the evidence for God stronger. I predict that if we ever discovered a multiverse, it would do the same thing. So another response to the design and fine-tuning is just, there's no fine-tuning. Probably the best book on this is written by Victor Stenger called The Fallacy of Fine-Tuning. In response to that, two scientists, Luke Barnes and Geraint Lewis, wrote a book called A Fortunate Universe. And Stenger's arguments are really clever. He writes in such a way that if you just read the book, you go, he's really destroyed fine-tuning. But his arguments are subtle, and let me show you an example. So here's one of his major arguments. And it's a little bit complicated, but I want to show it to you for a reason. It says, if our formulation of laws of nature is to be objective, it must be point of view invariant. In other words, if we're going to have any laws at all, point of view invariant means that everyone must be able to come up with the same laws. No matter who you are, where you are, you should see the same laws. Your point of view shouldn't matter. That makes sense. He then goes on to say, invariance implies conserved quantities. This is something called Noether's theorem, which we know is true. So therefore, if they must be point of view invariant, and invariance implies conserved quantities, when our models do not depend then on a particular point of view in direction of space or particular moment in time, then those models must necessarily contain certain things. Linear momentum, angular momentum, and energy all conserved. And so he's saying that the conservation principles are not laws built into the universe or handed down by deity to govern the behavior of matter. Instead, they are principles governing the behavior of physicists. In other words, he's saying, if you want to make a universe that makes sense at all, that's point of view invariant, and that invariance implies that these conservation laws are there, then the laws aren't arbitrary, they have to be there. Therefore, there's no fine-tuning. There's a problem with this. Here's the problem. His conclusion down here is actually based on a false premise. This word invariance should not be the word invariance. It should not be the same word as this. It should be the word symmetry. Now, to you, invariant and symmetry might look a lot alike, but in physics, they have very different meanings. And they have precise meanings. And if I put the word symmetry here, which is the correct word, it's symmetry that implies conserved quantities, not invariance. The whole argument falls apart. And if you read the book, you would never pick that up. You would go, oh, he's right. These laws have to be there. But as a physicist, he's using the wrong word, and he's using it to make a conclusion that's therefore false. And the whole book is full of things like that. That when you read as someone who doesn't know the physics, you go, oh, it's so solid. And you read as someone who does, you go, why did he change the word? Oh, because that makes his point. But it's the wrong word. So Luke Barnes wrote a very technical rebuttal to him. So where Stenger writes a popular book to try to refute fine-tuning, Luke Barnes writes a technical scholarly article and rebuttal. So if you want to read something about this that's really technical and you like physics, here's the article. And the consensus of those who read both, and I have, is that Barnes' case is far stronger than Stenger's. Now, if you don't want to read a technical article, here's a non-technical book that I mentioned. And this is a cool book because one of the authors is a non-theist and one is a theist, and they completely agree the universe is fine-tuned. One thinks it's because of multiverse, one thinks it's because of God. But they say in this book, the reaction against fine-tuning might stem from the belief that fine-tuning is the invention of a bunch of religious believers who hijack physics to their own ends. This is not the case. The field began in physics journals and remains with physicists. While there is more work to be done, physics has tended to consolidate our understanding of fine-tuning. The idea that fine-tuning does not exist and it's a bunch of religious people trying to shoehorn it in so they can point to God is just wrong. It's all in the physics journals. You can go read them. And you'll see that the universe is fine-tuned. All right, so what's the response to the origin of the universe? First of all, no one has any observations or information about what happened in the first 10 to the minus 35 seconds. So if I want to try to say there is no God, something has to happen in the first 10 to the minus 35 seconds that is speculative, that I don't know about. And so I have to put something there. And some of the proposals, I'll talk about two of them, is that there's no actual beginning of the universe or that the beginning was purely a natural event. So let's talk about those two. So, before we do, let me review what we do know. So at about 10 to the minus 35 seconds after the Big Bang, the visible universe was hot and dense and has expanded and cooled since. We talked about that. And all the known theoretical calculations indicate the universe had an actual beginning. And the BGV theorem is a really powerful theorem. There are no loopholes unless you invent new physics. It works for multiverses. Every universe ultimately had a beginning. There's no way around it unless you invent something that we don't know is true. The other thing that's a real problem is the entropy of the universe. Entropy, in layman's terms, is the amount of disorder. So the Big Bang was highly ordered. It wasn't an explosion. It was a highly tuned, ordered moment of creation. In fact, Roger Penrose has calculated that the entropy in the universe was fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 10th to the 123rd. He writes it's a number so small you could never, ever, ever write it down, even if you use all the particles in the universe. So almost every model cannot explain this. There are some that try to. So what do we know then with the scientific observations? That everything that actually is scientific, everything that's been observed, everything that's been calculated, supports this transcendent intelligent cause. So therefore, if you want to get out of that, you have to appeal to the gaps in our knowledge. So what's happened is instead of being a God of the gaps argument where theists are filling in the unknown with God, everything we do know, all the theory, all the calculation points to God. So the atheist is now filling in the things we don't know with atheism. It's become an atheism of the gaps. Because everything we do know looks a lot like God. So if there is no God, the only place I have to put him is in those places where we don't know. It's completely turned around. But these proposals aren't science, they're speculative. They always require unknown physics, and they always require the unknown physics to supersede the known physics. In other words, you have to wipe out what we do know and put in what we don't know in order to get God out of the picture. And most of them contradict the BGB theorem. Very few solve the entropy problem nonetheless. So let me just give you a couple examples. One is that there was no actual beginning. So first of all, it's got problems. It violates theory. It violates the BGB theorem. It violates the general theory of relativity. Some models have universes that oscillate back and forth. None of them solve the entropy problem. Here's a couple examples. Stephen Hawking has this thing called the no boundary condition in A Brief History of Time. The no boundary condition gets rid of what we call singularity, but it doesn't really get rid of a beginning. This is my favorite one. This made the news about 2 years ago. These two guys wrote a paper, and they say that in their model, the universe doesn't have a beginning. So you go read the paper, they use what are called Bohmian quantum trajectories. Now, I'm sure you guys know what that is, right? I don't have to explain that to you, right? Good. So what these are is they are like like a parallel road. And by definition, the parallel road will never come together. It will never have a place where it meets. Well, Bohmian quantum trajectories never come together. So they start with these and they say, look, when we use these, they never come together to a point where the universe begins. It's like saying, I'm on two parallel roads, and what an amazing fact, they never come together. So they start with the assumption that we're going to use quantum trajectories that don't have a beginning, and they come to the conclusion that there is no beginning. There's a word for that in logic. What's it called? Circular reasoning. And this made huge news that they've just shown that the universe didn't have a beginning. One of the authors of the paper, the BGB theorem, writes, with the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. This universe had a beginning. So the other proposals, maybe the beginning was a purely natural event. And you read lots of options. One is that the universe is eternal but stagnant. So it's like an egg that just sits there for eternity and finally burst open. Another idea is that the universe is one in a series of universes. So ours had a beginning, but there's this infinite progression. And another word, the major one, is that the universe is some kind of quantum fluctuation, which we'll talk about. So let's look at these three. So, is the universe eternal but stagnant? Well, this is shown to really have problems. It doesn't, it has to be finely tuned to allow the entropy to be so low in our universe. But the worst part is the quantum mechanics makes the stagnant universe unstable. So if I want to have this egg universe that just sits for eternity, and you do the math, it doesn't sit for eternity. It sits for a short time, and then it has to burst forth. So you can't have an eternal universe. So it's got fatal flaws. It doesn't seem viable. What about this one? The universe is one in a series of universes. And there's so many models it'd be impossible to talk about them. But basically, almost all of them don't solve the entropy problem. And almost all of them require that there's still a beginning because of the BGB theorem. And so it really doesn't solve the problem. But this is the major one people think. The universe is a result of some kind of quantum fluctuation. So Larry Krauss wrote this book, Universe from Nothing. So in our universe, an amazing thing happens. Particles seem to pop out of the universe from nowhere. They're called quantum fluctuations. It happens inside every proton in your body, that occasionally a particle will pop into existence and then go away. The problem is these quantum fluctuations happen within the space-time of our universe. They don't happen outside of our universe. So you can't use them to create our universe, because they only happen within our universe. So what people do is Larry Krauss writes an analogy. Well, maybe if particles pop into existence in our universe, then there was something before our universe that allows universes to pop into existence. There's no observational evidence for this at all. It's completely an analogy. If quantum mechanics does this in our universe, then maybe it pops universes into existence in another reality. But here's the problem. If you have something that pops universes into existence, it's not nothing. It's something that has the capability, like our universe can pop particles into existence. And philosophers have argued with Krauss over and over. What you're proposing is not nothing. And he's like, a little kid who says, yes, it is nothing. And everybody says, no, it's not. He says, yes, it is. And he's got no proof. It's just an assertion that it's nothing. But it's not, because it has the ability to pop things into existence. And I even noticed this, right? A universe that comes from some pre-existing entity that's transcendent, which is what he's proposing, sounds a lot like God. So even though he's an atheist, his proposition sounds a lot like God. Finally, none of these things proposed have any observation or theoretical evidence. You can believe it if you want, but it's a belief based on zero evidence. And all of these proposals require some kinds of laws of physics to exist before our universe. And that's a problem. So Lincoln writes, the description of the creation of the universe from nothing is given in terms of the laws of physics. That makes you wonder, where are these laws? If the laws describe the creation of the universe, that suggests they existed prior to the universe. The question that nobody has any idea how to address is where these laws came from and why these laws in particular. And I would say that nobody has a suggestion for that, just the non-theist. But finally, let me come full circle. Suppose that there is a natural origin of the universe. Suppose we were to find that the universe did come from a quantum vacuum before this. Fine. As a theist who believes the Bible, this is still in agreement with what the Bible says. The Bible only talks about the beginning of this universe, and it says that this universe had a beginning of space-time, matter, and energy. And that's already been shown to be true. The Bible says nothing about what God did before or how he created this one. So the biblical idea that the universe had a beginning of space-time, matter, and energy is already confirmed. And even if I find it was caused by some other natural event, well, God uses natural events. So in reality, it doesn't matter what I find someday maybe about the speculative ideas that cause the universe. The biblical idea has already been confirmed by all the things we know. That's not going to change. So all the evidence we have supports a divine designer. If I'd come to you 100 years ago, there would be no scientific information about the origin of the universe and little about the design. And if I had proposed to you that in 100 years from now, all the evidence is going to point to an actual beginning of the universe that looks a lot like a transcendent God, I would have been laughed at in any university in the country. But that's exactly what's happened. The fine-tuning of the universe has been developed, it's supported by known physics, and the attempts are inadequate. So the non-theist now has to appeal to the atheism of the gaps. Because everything we discover, everything that we know, not that we speculate about, over the last 100 years, points to some kind of divine being. So to me, the proposal that a transcendent, intelligent being created and designed the universe is really the best explanation for the evidence. Maybe not the best explanation for the speculative ideas, but probably so, because they still have to line up with all the known physics. So let's take one more step in this journey. Let's ask the question, so what if the universe is designed? And Paul Davies, again, who's agnostic, writes to me a remarkable statement. He says, if physics is the product of design, which it certainly looks like, then the universe must have a purpose. And the evidence of modern physics, not the evidence from theology, but the evidence of modern physics, suggests strongly to me that that purpose includes us. Isn't that amazing? The evidence from modern physics seems to indicate that if the universe is designed as a purpose, and that purpose is us. Well, again, if you're a theist or someone who believes the Bible is true, that's not surprising. Hoyle's super intellect, Davies' purpose that includes us, is described in the Bible. Some king about, 2,700, 2,800 years ago said the same thing. When I consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place. What is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him? Isn't it amazing that the universe seems to have a purpose, and that purpose includes man? The Bible goes on to say, God will take great delight in you. He will quiet you with his love. So this idea that the purpose includes us is not a new idea. It's a new idea from science. It's not a new idea. So back to Alan Sandage. He said, it was my science that drove me to the conclusion that the world is much more complicated than science. It's only through the supernatural that I can understand the mystery of existence. And George Greenstein, an astrophysicist, writes, as we survey all the evidence, the thought insistently arises that some supernatural agency, or rather agency with a capital A, must be involved. Is it possible that suddenly, without intending to, we have stumbled upon scientific proof of the existence of the Supreme Being? Now, I don't think we found proof. I said at the beginning, proof in science is only true mathematically and logically, but the evidence is overwhelming. Now, before I actually stop and take your questions, I want to take two more steps along this idea. The first is people say, when I give this talk sometime, well, you've shown maybe that there's a deistic God, a God who maybe created the universe, but you as a believer in the Christian God would say much more. So let me just show you a few things. Why do I think that this creator is personal? And I'll look at what we've talked about. The design in the universe implies an intelligent mind. Mind is characteristic of personhood. The universe seems to be designed with humans in mind. The creator of personality you would expect to be personal. But even more so, there's another mystery. Humans have this sense of purpose and destiny as well as morality. And where does that come from? The atoms I study, the quarks I study, have no indication of purpose or destiny or morality. They're just inanimate matter, and we're all made of that. So where do these deeper things come from? I think a personal creator best explains those kinds of things. And then why particular, as a scientist, why particularly Christianity? Let me just show you a few things. First of all, Christianity is not a worldview that says just believe and don't ask questions. Christianity tells you to ask questions and get good answers. Jesus said that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with your heart, strength, soul, and mind. How can you love anything with your mind if you can't ask questions? And Paul writes, test everything and hold on to what is good. Don't just take it, don't take my word for it, go test it. This is the call to Christians. Second, Christianity involves a search for truth and makes testable truth claims. As a scientist, I love when you tell me something is testable. I'm going to go test it. Christianity makes testable claims. One of the major ones is that this man, Jesus, actually lived and rose from the dead. That's a historical event. You go test whether historical events happened or not. You want to know if Christianity is true? Go test that event. And that's why you have evidence for it. You don't just have to accept it. Christianity makes claims that can be tested. And then finally, I think that any good idea, any good scientific idea, any good idea has a broad range of applications, has a broad explanatory power. And I just believe that the Christian worldview best answers the big questions in life, about morality, about social problems, about so many things. And so these things attract me not just to a deistic God, but in particular to the Christian God. So here's kind of my summary statement, and after this I'll let you ask some questions. It says, the discoveries of modern science give abundant evidence for the existence of God. The findings suggest not just a deistic God, but a transcendent, intelligent designer who created the universe and has a purpose for humanity in agreement with the attributes of God as described in the Bible.